Bart Ehrman will not be interviewing Megan Lewis for this special edition of the Misquoting Jesus podcast. Instead, Megan will be questioning his colleague at UNC Chapel Hill. Hugo Mendez is an expert on the issue of whether the Gospel of John in the New Testament should be considered a forgery. In this episode, he will not be dealing with 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. Hugo has been an assistant professor in our Department of Religious Studies since 2018. He came to us from Yale Divinity School, where he had been a lecturer for a couple of years and did a postdoc at the Yale Institute of Sacred Music. Hugo knows many languages, including Greek, Latin, Armenian, Optic, Old Church Slavonic, Sanskrit, and some Semitic languages. He speaks English and Spanish, reads French, German, and Italian, and retooled his skills to become a superb New Testament scholar. Hugo's first book came out just a couple of months ago from Oxford University Press and is called The Cult of Stephen in Jerusalem, Inventing a Patron Martyr. He's written several articles and is working on a book on the Gospel and Letters of John. The Gospel of John is probably the most beloved gospel by readers today, and most people assume that John, the son of Zebedee, wrote it. But the Gospel doesn't start by saying it was John writing here. The author of the Gospel of John never identified himself, so people thought John, the son of Zebedee, wrote it. Still, John has a particular way of constructing its author, so Christians had to determine and speculate over who wrote these texts. In the 2nd century, John the author makes himself in a very particular way, positioning himself among the eyewitnesses to Jesus' life. The disciple whom Jesus loved is the only way the text speaks of this figure, and he is the one that people generally call the beloved disciple. He is the one the author positions himself as the people with whom he interacted with Jesus. The beloved disciple first appears in chapter 13 when Jesus is having his final supper with his disciples, and he will show up in other scenes over the next few days of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection in the narrative. The text hints that the beloved disciple is the author. The author describes a supernatural, unexpected event at the crucifixion, when Jesus' side is pierced by a spear, and blood and water rush out, tying into the idea that Jesus has this unique living water of the Spirit within him. The author almost self-consciously tries to stress the credibility of the detail he's just given, so you may believe him. It seems closer than that because the beloved disciple is one of the figures who saw Jesus. The narrator says that this person knows that he tells the truth, which gives you the impression that this person is still alive. He also says that the testimony of this figure is given to the readers, which makes it seem like the narrator himself. The beloved disciple's testimony that he saw the things written so that you may believe fits with the narrator's purpose in writing the book and knits the two together more closely. The reception history of the Gospel of John is quite clear that it was written by the disciple whom Jesus loved, and that tradition is just as strong as the tradition that says that the disciple of the secretary of Peter wrote Mark. I ironize, the one who gives us our earliest indication of John's identity, and I think the Gospel was written in the early 2nd century. Gospel John was written around the turn of the century, and that's a rough target for when it was written. Papias did know the Gospel of John, but he didn't name it as such. He may have made it up or called it Fred. I mean, is there a reason to think Papa named it John? The first time it's intended E.V. John is Irenaeus, and the reception history doesn't start with Irenaeus, but it does start with John chapter 21. Scholars have appreciated that chapter 21 of John was probably added later to the Gospel, and they've taken off that chapter and added a verse that feels at first glance like a very fitting conclusion to the book. The book ends with a point that many other things could be contained in this book but are not, and then a chapter later, a new passage is added that describes another appearance of Jesus. Scholars think this was probably added later, and the disciple Jesus loved is perhaps the author. The end of chapter 21 features Peter and the beloved disciple with Jesus, and a verse where whoever is writing chapter 21 is probably not the author. He's drawn together language from 3 different places, including language from 114 and 1935, and he's also combined pronouns to make the point that the disciple whom Jesus loved is the disciple who has written this text. I thought you would say that the author of chapter 21 believed that the beloved disciple had written the rest of the gospel, but you're not. I believe the author of chapter 21 wanted to position himself as the same person as the author of chapters 1 through 20. The author of chapter 21 ties all these threads together in the ultimate conclusion of his extra chapter. He makes it very clear that it's the disciple whom Jesus loved who has written these things up to and including his section of the book, and then he ends up with the I. The author of John's Gospel leaves several clues as to who the disciple who penned this Gospel is, including the fact that Jesus has the Last Supper scene right with his disciples and starts washing their feet. The disciple Jesus loved is reclining on the bosom of Jesus at the Last Supper. The text says Peter has to ask a question to Jesus through the beloved disciple, because he is the most prominent disciple of Jesus according to the other correct synoptic Gospels. The author of the beloved disciple claims to be John, the son of Zebedee, but does he make the implicit claim, or is this an induction that early Christians make? I think the author of this text is trying to be more subtle than a single target by leaving a little note, a little ambiguity, weaving something in and keeping himself alive for another day. In either event, the author claims to be one of Jesus' closest disciples and knows the scoop, so whether he intends you to think this is John, the son of who's not mentioned, is irrelevant. If you're enjoying the Misquoting Jesus podcast, you'd probably also like my online courses. I produced a number so far with multi-lecture classes on the New Testament Gospels and the books of the Pentateuch, standalone lectures on the Christmas story, and the earliest Christian views of Jesus. When I'm using the term forgery here, I'm referring to an author who presents himself as someone other than who he is, and that can take many different forms, including putting a pseudonym on his text or taking on a false name. You see this kind of thing happening in different texts. A great example is the Wisdom of Solomon, which is a forgery that now forms part of the Catholic Bible, and you get the same thing in the Hebrew Bible, which is a forgery that claims to be written by Solomon. Even if the author gives a clear indication without giving his name that the book is a forgery, the book is still considered a forgery because the author has constructed himself differently than the author of this text. New Testament scholars frequently discuss this as pseudepigraphy, and they get nervous when you say forgery. Still, I think that term is flawed because it has in mind titles and direct authorial descriptions and attributions, which are not the case for some of this literature. The author of this book didn't put a label on it, and it doesn't have a direct name expressed, so it's not a good candidate for pseudepigraphy. The term authorial intent is being used for things it's not all meant to be used for, and it's also deliberately opaque. Scholars in our field talk about things in a way that nobody knows what I'm talking about, but everyone knows what I'm talking about when I use the word forgery, and I think that's a conversation to have, but when you speak about forgery, you mean a false authorial claim. An author who accurately represents himself can lie, vent, and exaggerate. Someone who writes under a pen or pseudonym can include accurate information. The question of historicity is different from what the authorial claim made in the text. Ancient people thought about this practice as problematically as we do today and responded negatively to people caught in the act. Scholars are prone to say that because something is widespread, it must have been widely culturally accepted, but I don't think that's true. I believe it tells us that it was prevalent and that the author is not one of Jesus' closest disciples. The author of the Gospel of John claims to be an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, but the views that Jesus articulates in his text are not those that Jesus says in the synoptic Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. The message that Jesus brings to humans is that they can be born of the Spirit, that they can receive Jesus dwelling within them, that they can access celestial realms, that they can possess eternal life and immortality, and that they will be exalted into a divine glory. Jesus teaches a coherent, sophisticated, complex theology that may fit very well with Alexandrian Jewish speculations, maybe the thought of Paul and later Pauline interpreters imitators in 2nd century Christianity, but it's not going to do into the lifetime of Jesus. The author of the Gospel of John is aware that the Jesus he's presenting is different from the Jesus represented in the other Gospels, and he needs to find a way to justify the teachings of Jesus. The Gospel of John's author is deceptive when he claims to be the closest disciple of one of the closest disciples of Jesus. He uses many of the same motifs and images as the Jesus of the Synoptics. Jesus reinterprets all of these things in John, saying that his kingdom is not of this world and that one has to be born of spirit even to see it. The author constructs a Jesus that says it more directly and in the author's theological terms, but in ways evocative of the synoptic Jesus. As a reader, you have access through an eyewitness purportedly to some of the things that Jesus said at times the synoptics did not record, and John is going to align itself with a lot of the strategies you're going to find in apocryphal Gospels throughout the 2nd century. Mark's Gospel is an invented material that becomes the hermeneutical key for everything you might read elsewhere. Engage in the Jesus tradition so that the next time you read another Gospel, you'll either think that maybe Jesus didn't quite say it this way or perhaps we've misinterpreted this. Scholars talk about how a book will guide for reading other books, and if you've got 4 Gospels together and John kind of climaxes it, then you read the other 3 in light of what you already know from John. Some people wonder how a Christian can think that the author of John is lying about his identity and deceiving people about what Jesus taught in the New Testament. Still, there are Christian scholars out there who have these views. The Bible tells us that King David does not come across very well in the biblical tradition. When I teach forgery and pseudepigraphy to my students, I talk about the fundamentalist modernist controversy, which arose 100 years ago when Darwinian evolution was coming to the forefront of national attention. There were different ways that Christians responded to the scientific revolution, including mainline denominations that were open to new ideas and fundamentalist denominations that doubled down on the inerrancy of Scripture. I tell my students the history of the Catholic Church and how Vatican II allowed Catholic scholars to consider creationism in a new way. I remind them that Christians have responded differently to this subject and must position themselves within the more significant debate. You can't close your eyes to these issues, and I think Christianity is dead if it refuses to accept logic and knowledge. I have a Master of Divinity degree from a Protestant theological seminary, and the basic view of things like the author of John being a blood disciple and his reports of what Jesus said and did not being accurate were taught to me by Presbyterian ministers. This is not people who think this is the dividing line between faith and non-faith in a way the fundamentalists' right has convinced them. They've let a few people in the early 20th century set the terms for how we do this with all the data we have today. If any of your listeners want to know more about my point of view, I have an article published in the Journal for the Study of the New Testament that gives a bibliography for some of the things I've raised. Bart Herman and Megan Lewis welcome you to another episode of Misquoting Jesus with Bart. We'll be back with a new episode next Tuesday, so please subscribe to our show.